what would it take for Wisconsin to have the DNR as an independent scientific agency rather than its current status as a political, George Meyer referred to it as a rented agency by the party in charge, because science has been dismissed. This last budget's very reflective of that. So that was sort of to me, that was a watershed going the wrong direction. How could we reinstate that?
Take a crack at it. I mean, obviously, when candidates run for office, it has to come up as an issue. The DNR board was quote unquote independent before, appointed by the governor, but it was a separate board, and it finally, because of a reorganization, I think it was the Kellogg Commission, put it back in as part of the cabinet, reporting to the governor. And by the way, both Democratic governors and Republican governors have both liked that idea of having the DNR secretary as a member of the cabinet. I personally like it too, because it means in effect that the DNR is responsible to the governor, is elected by the people. So I don't have a problem with that. As to the science part of it, I don't understand why they're debilitating the science capabilities of the DNR. I just don't understand it. And I was in the Nature Conservancy for a long time, and it's a science-based organization. I don't know how you manage our natural resources without a scientific underpinning. I don't know. Do you want to add something to that, Dale?
Sure. Well, in the interest of full disclosure, let me just say clearly I voted on both sides of this issue. I don't necessarily see that as a weakness. It just means that I've spent 32 years in public life. I've watched the good and the bad with the public, with state agencies, and I've watched the frustration of business people and farmers, sports people, and yet at the same time I've also seen excesses in the political process, which has totally, I think, impaired the mission of the Department of Natural Resources. I said I tend to be a science-based guy, but let me just be clear. If anytime you run for public office and you become a public official, you soon realize there's more to the world than just science. There's conflict management, has been pointed out. There's, promoting cooperation between competing user groups. And there has to be a role for that to play out in the process, or you'll never be allowed to do as much as you can with science. And I think, quite frankly, some people within the natural resources community have sort of forgotten that, and we've gone excessively in the wrong direction. How do we get back to that? I would say it's the same points that I just made to you before about the need for us to re-engage in the process and be fierce about open records, about people tending to skirt the law. It's not funny. Everybody laughs about it, but it takes away people's rights.
The other thought I have is a Wisconsin idea, and it used to be, that's the way we used to run this state. We used to engage the best and the brightest through a series of public input processes. They were legislative councils. It's a magnificent device and I've been on a couple, where they again pull in the best and the brightest. It results in a bill going before the legislature. We used to have task forces, blue ribbon commissions on complex issues. Governors routinely used it. Tommy Thompson he had probably more going than any governor I've ever seen. Under Governor Doyle and under Governor Walker, there have been virtually none of them in both cases, and that's a bipartisan omission. So a return to the Wisconsin ideas on these complicated issues. Let's take the high capacity wells issue in the central part of the state, drying up the Little Plover Creek and a few lakes. That probably ought to be the subject of a legislative council or a task force, where we bring in the smartest people, including the scientists, and get good input from across the board, try to resolve the conflicts in an open way, and then come up with a piece of legislation and it'd have to have some compromises in it, of course, that the people in this state can, as a majority, support. So a return to the Wisconsin idea would be one way to solve that problem on the big issues. Could have been done on mining, wasn't.
Well, it actually was. Tim Cullen, I think Tim Cullen deserves an enormous amount of credit picking up on then when the Democrats got in control briefly and having a very open public process. It wasn't a blue ribbon necessary commission, but it was exceedingly open and in contrast to the way the bill was developed the session before. And it's also the tradition that Senator Jelk and I used in crafting our proposal, which we could have passed through the Senate, knew we couldn't pass through the Assembly, and rather than poison the well, we agreed to allow it to be returned to committee because the assurance was from Senator Fitzgerald that there would be a committee, a hearing by Senator Zipper, and we would have a chance to hash things out. Unfortunately, he breached our trust, and the committee never met.
I do stand corrected on that. There were pretty exhaustive public hearings. That's another way. Public hearings, exhaustive public hearings on these bills. I was in a sort of a funny position on that mining thing. I was chairman of the Nature Conservancy at the time, and I was on the board of the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, and 1 foot in each camp. And I was encouraging the WMC board to hold GTAC to the same environmental management standards that I apply to my own company. It's called an EMS, an environmental management system. It tracks on the ISO 14000 certification process, which we do at Serigraph. And I kept asking GTAC to come forward with their EMS and make it public, and they didn't do it. And then I even made overtures to GTAC that I would personally go down and meet with them, and the TNC would put themselves in the middle of trying to pull out the business side of this and the environmental management side of the business side and put it before the public, and maybe there was a compromise in there someplace. If the water could be returned to the Bad River in completely pure conditions, and I don't know that that was possible or not possible because we never saw the EMS. At any rate, on that one I fault the company for being not forthcoming.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have a question here in the audience.
Yeah. I had a question. How do you combat the apathy in this country? I know we need to get investigative reporting, but in Michigan we had a really good investigative reporter who was then let go from the company after 30 years with the newspaper. And it's just so frustrating. In Michigan, they did a study or a survey. 67% of the people who responded could not name our two U.S. senators. And when it was broken down by the UP, 0% of the people responding could name their 2 senators.
So people are stupid? I don't think so.
I think they could probably name the winner of American Idol, but they can't name their senators.
I'm not that cynical. You know, I look at the reaction we got on the taking the powers away from the NRB board and on stewardship, and the reaction was, as I said, swift and furious, and we got them reversed. So, you know, you're not going to get everybody engaged in public policy. I mean, that's too much to ask. But I think, you know, enough people are engaged that you can affect public policy if you get the issues out there right. In terms of investigating reporter, I was one. Spent about 30 of my years as a journalist. It's sad what's happening to newspapers. Very, very sad. We could have that's not the subject for today, but it's a big, deep subject. I think it's going to be more of a nonprofit entity, newspapers. We're going to have the rich guys in this country take them over. They buy football teams and basketball teams and get stadium and get buildings named after them, and now they're going to have to buy newspapers and keep them alive, which is what's happening.
I had mentioned, you know, things where people need to be involved. We had an effort in Wisconsin not too long ago to wipe out our Center for Investigative Journalism at the UW-Madison. A lot of people I know, including myself, got very angry and did our level best to get attention for that, and we got that notion reversed. You have to train investigative reporters, and that's something that just happens, and we do it pretty well. But John is right. When I went to the Capitol 32 years ago, I think there were about 30 reporters there. It was a lot, and now we're down to just a handful, less than 10, all told. And that's a problem because there aren't enough of them, and we need to find ways to get more people digging in, and we need to make sure that the laws work for those people. They get run around a lot. But, you know, the answer to it, is it the same answer that each and every one of you know very well for the causes that you're concerned about. You got to get out there and apply the shoe lever and find ways to speak to as many people as possible.
You know, when Paul Hayes, who was the environmental reporter for the Journal, worked at the Journal, there were 230 journalists in the newsroom, Paul. I think we had 120 when I was at the Sentinel. How many? 360. Between the two papers? Yeah, that's about right. Today there's about 130. Yeah, it was 360, it's 130 today, so it's that. So one of the things happened is the Marquette Law School has endowed a couple of journalism positions, and so there's going to be new forms of journalism. They're popping up all over the place. Kaiser Permanente has a new service on health issues. So the society and the business of news gathering will morph, but I share your concern that we lose the investigative guys. You'll have to endow an investigative reporter. And just like the endowed chairs at a university, I'd be glad to be your first recipient.
Yeah, we'll be touching more on journalism tomorrow during a panel.
Okay, that's off the table. Another question in the front row.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time also. A comment leading to a question. The DNR did not permit its staff to attend this meeting, which feels a little bit like the agency missions not being fulfilled. The question for you is, to restore our democracy with a little d in Wisconsin, if you could wave a magic wand and amend our Constitution, how would you protect our democracy?
That's too big a question for me. I'll give it to the big thinker here.
Well, I think that I would, we don't have to do it with a constitutional amendment, but one thing that I would do is I would do a constitutional amendment that guaranteed an Iowa model for reapportionment, where it's done by nonpartisan staff. There's strict limits on what can be considered factors, and it's done in the open, and there's a highly public process. Then the legislators still get to vote on it, but they have to stand up and say why, and everybody gets to see the map at the same time, something that doesn't occur in this state under Democrats or Republicans right now. That's one thing I would do. And I would do more to promote open records and campaign finance reform.
Actually, I do have some big thoughts. We're not going to do much about the public financing. Those Supreme Court decisions are really tough. I don't know how you get around the big money into policy. The only virtue is it's about even on both sides. They both raise a ton of money. Term limits would help. That would be good, because these guys get entrenched in these gerrymandered safe districts, and they're there for, God, we got geriatric politics in Wisconsin. Fred Risser's been there 60 years. You know, Dave Obey was in for 42 years. Sensenbrenner's been there 39 years. Good God. You know, we normally in any business life, you rotate every 5-10 years in your jobs. So term limits would help. More direct democracy would help if we could loosen up the referendum standards in Wisconsin. They're fairly tough. It's fairly tough to get a referendum going. We could turn over more issues to the citizens. Take the arena for the Bucks in Milwaukee. That'd be a good one to put to the 7 counties on referendum to see if the citizens support it. So those are some ideas. You could, and some states have done that. They've got more access to the ballot by direct voting. They have term limits, and getting rid of the safe districts would all be big steps towards the little d.
So your comment about there's more to making a decision than just science and more to the process is, I think, well-founded, and that's something that we could all do with a reminder now and then. But as I see it, the problem is actually the exact opposite. I mean, there's a rising tide of anti-intellectualism and anti-science in this country. And it's manifesting itself in things like the dismissal of the scientists from DNR, the removal, I mean, in just this issue, the wolf and stuff, in removal of scientists from panels, advisory panels and things like that, in the ignoring of scientific analyses and scientific facts. I mean, climate deniers are still a thing. It's kind of hard to believe, but they are. And so Bob's question was perhaps maybe from the policy perspective about how do we restore science, but my question is more from a scientist. Of course, you're not scientists, but knowing something about how scientists plug themselves into the debate and stuff, how can we as scientists reestablish ourselves? How can we, in the face of constantly being shut out of these debates, how can we have input into these public policy decisions?
Well, again, I think it's really about the process, and I want to disagree with my friend John a little bit. That is a huge problem with these billionaires, even if they're equally split on both sides. I've watched with great interest the primary process in my own party, and it disgusts me that all of these people who, when I was young, used to see as heroes, people who were going to lead the country, now spend all their time jetting around talking to billionaires, and they don't have time, unless it's in a highly scripted, encircled manner, to deal with silly things like voters and people. And, I feel like something's been stripped away from me. Why should I be involved in politics or public policy if we're going to allow the process to be a wholly owned subsidiary for 24 billionaires? How's that different than what goes on in Russia? It isn't. Now, again, I think they ought to be able to participate. I just don't think they ought to be able to drown out everybody else's voice. And with respect to the science part, it's about education. Education is also, like journalists, like scientists, like educators, they're all under attack right now. What's the first thing despots do when they take over a country? They round up the journalists, they round up the intellectuals, and that's what I kind of look at right now. So I think what you have to do is take a look at who's out there and stand firm for that. I mean, if we have an educational process that teaches people that evolution is the way things happen, I think, we only have ourselves to blame. And I think it's important, with all due respect to the governor, that journalists ask questions like that directly to people in a public way so we can all see. I think, that openness is what will lead us to where we want to go. There are great people in this state. I've knocked on enough doors to know that. They're just tired, frustrated, and they're mainly focusing on trying to survive in a state that's getting poorer.
Great dialogue. 1 minute, gentlemen. Thank you.
Well, to get around those Supreme Court decisions, we're going to have a U.S. constitutional amendment. That's probably the only way around it. I don't like the money in politics either, and besides, it wipes out small contributions from guys like me. So why even bother, If some guy's writing a check for hundreds of thousands, what good is writing a check for $200 or $500? Restoring science, we just have to vote against those guys that don't, when they start talking about, creationism, just vote against them. I mean, if they're that dumb, they shouldn't be in office.
For those of you who are interested in the money side of this, there is a group out there called Move to Amend, and they're making great progress in a grassroots way, getting people to understand that we need to have a change in that. And I think it's going to take a long time, but I think the more people understand, the better chance there is. Google it, Move to Amend. Okay, we're done.